Next up, we're going to have Steve Kilpack come up. Several of you have probably already heard Steve, but Steve he farms in west central Iowa, just east of Council Bluffs in the hills. And Steve used to be a research agronomist with Pioneer, thinks outside the box. If you haven't heard him, that's probably one thing that I appreciate the most is it's not your common agronomist talk. So Steve will challenge our thinking on what's possible. He also farms, he has drip irrigation, and understands the challenges that we have. One of the things that I think really adds value when we listen to Steve's talk is a lot of times guys put in drip irrigation but don't understand everything else that needs to be in place to optimize it. So what other things do we need to be doing to optimize our production besides just putting in an irrigation system? There's a whole bunch of things we need to be thinking about. So with that, I'll turn it over.
A real weird, nerdy crop guy. That's the best way I could describe myself. I started farming in 2002. We had a relatively small farming operation. My dad has historically been very frugal. Some would say he's as tight as bark on a tree. And let's just say him and I don't always see eye to eye on what we're doing, but my dad is also an innovative person. I've taken a lot of the things that he's done on the farm and built upon those. And that smaller farming operation led to a lot of outside the box type thinking of driving profitability. And that's led me down a path of really pursuing and trying to help growers understand their profitability, where to make investments, where to put their inputs, and really drive higher yields. So the bulk of this presentation is a little bit of data sharing on some of the things that we're doing, looking at a software platform that we've developed to help farmers really understand what's going on in their fields. And then there's a lot of pictures about some different research that we're doing on our farm, and I encourage everybody to ask questions. I think in front of pretty much everybody there's a worksheet that has Powered by Acumen at the top. And as you look at this presentation and think about your farming operation, really take some time to think about those questions that are on that worksheet. I'm not going to make you hand them in, so this is just for you and your own exercise. But the idea behind this is we have to really sit down and think about what are our own personal goals and objectives. You know, it's not just about raising 400 bushel corn or winning the NCGA tour. That may not be the goal for everybody. It might be that I really want to increase my profitability on my farming operation, or maybe those two things go hand in hand. So I've got 10 steps to higher yields, greater profits, and enhanced decision making. And hopefully you will ask some questions, because there's some interesting things in here. So step one, the first step in this 10-step goal, understanding where you are and where you would like to go and establishing realistic goals. I was an instructor at a community college while I was doing a bunch of other stuff for about 10 years. And this was one of the neatest exercises that I would do with my students. Can you actually sit down and develop realistic, attainable goals? Most people, if I asked them, give me a goal for your farming operation this year. And for example, they might say, well, I want to make $120,000. And that is a goal. But there are a lot of steps that you have to take and a lot of little goals that you have to hit along the way. So establishing those little goals are really the most important piece to your success. And hopefully that will lead to the longer term goal that you have in place. So these questions coincide with your worksheet. And again, I encourage you to think about this at your own farming level. What is your current yield and profitability level? I will spend a lot of time discussing least input, maximum output, and how we optimize nutrients and seed to get maximum return on investment. And that really should be all of our jobs. Do you know what your current break-even costs are? Do you know where you're spending money? And with most farming operations that I work with, there's typically $100 or more of general leakage, just money that kind of disappears in the mix. And then do you have a detailed understanding of what is influencing your yield? And this is something that I'm really passionate about, is just taking a look at your farm information and really understanding why your yield is the way that it is. And again, create those realistic, attainable goals. So this is our website that we developed. It's www.acumen.ag. I encourage everyone to jump on and register. This has been something that we've been working on for a really long time. And it's taken a long time to get to the point where I've been satisfied enough and the automation works. But if you jump on this, you can upload your yield data and you'll get free reports. Profitability, break even, seeding recommendations, and you'll be able to get that in a pretty quick turnaround time, less than 24 hours typically. The reason why I'm telling you this is, number one, I want you to see what the value is in your information that you're capturing. But we use a default value in this free version, and you can start to see where you're making money and losing money. And this is an example of a break-even report and a profitability report. Now, when I see information like this, and I'm looking at you recognize that field, Kelly? When I see areas that are red, that triggers a question in my mind. What should I be doing differently? And for years and years and years, we've talked about, well, we're going to variable rate everything so that we can make everything equal. How many people have been doing that? Have you had a lot of success when you look at your yield monitor maps? Are things becoming more equal? Is there still variability in the fields? My experience has been there's a tremendous amount of variability, and I'm going to show you why I think that is. And then what we can do to address some of these profitability challenges. So again, setting those realistic, attainable goals. Can you improve upon your yield goal and your profitability goal? And in reality, your yields may stay the same, but your profitability can go way up. And what I really like about that message, if my yields stay the same, but I can put more money in your pocket, or you can go out and figure out how to put more money in your pocket, then you can start to invest in technology that really drives yield and protects yield, like drip irrigation. Now, there's only a few things you can do on your farm that's going to move the needle like that. What is that realistic profitability goal? Everybody's numbers are different. Oftentimes I'll ask people, what's your cost per acre on your pickup? If I wrote a check for a $50,000 pickup and I have 1,000 acres of corn, that pickup cost me $50 an acre. And it's those little things that we don't always think about that make huge differences in our bottom line. And now in the time that we're living in ag, margins are going to get tighter. I've been in the seed business. I don't think there's going to be an opportunity for the seed guy to show up and say, hey, guess what? We just dropped the price. Fertilizer's not doing it. Herbicides aren't doing it. So the variables that you really have control over, those prices are going to be relatively fixed and probably continue to go up. If our commodity prices don't go up, what does that mean for your margin? So the only way you can correct it is to be a super efficient user of those inputs. Hyper efficiency is the future of farming. It should have been the way of farming for the last 20 years. But for whatever reason, for a lot of us, when we think about change, it makes us have this weird feeling in our gut. And I guess that's where I'm different. Change is the only thing I know and accept. I am dissatisfied with nearly everything that I do every day and want to change it. That's kind of a curse also, right? I mean, but the reality is I'm constantly seeking for some level of improvement and differentiation. And so what tools do you think you will need to accomplish this task? So step number 2, and this is the first thing that every grower needs to look at on their farm, after they've established a goal, how am I going to get to that goal? I have to know what my soil pH and my soil textures are. And you have to know that at a very detailed level. How many people have grid sampled on like a 2.5 acre grid or a 2 acre grid or a 1 acre grid? I have seen just as much variability in 1 acre of pH as I have in 100 acres. So what that means is the density of our data isn't good enough. Because if I'm going to make decisions where I'm going to be super efficient at how I manage my inputs, I have to have the right tools to look at information. And this is, how many people have heard of Varus? They're down in Salina. Okay, so we have a couple Varus machines, and we measure pH and soil texture with those machines. And in this field, 149 acres, these are all the pH samples and the pH variability that exists in that. That's a ton of variability. And if we were to take the liming recommendations and put the grid map over the top of this, we would have spent about 3 times as much on lime as we did in this recommendation here. So you can afford to pay for that piece of data just in lime management alone. Now what happens if you have a pH, so here's a high pH spot. This is all fairly high pH. This ridge is low pH. What if I would have interpolated that data and I would have made a lime recommendation that would have carried farther down the hill? Do I want to put more lime on high pH soils? No, so this other statement correct both low and high pH. And most people say, well, you can't do anything with high pH. And that's not true. It's a little more challenging to manage, but you can manage around high pH. Should be one of your top goals on your farming operation if you have high pH, to figure out how to displace some of the damages that occur. So we'll take about 10 samples per acre on the go. If you don't have somebody in the area that has a Varus machine, go buy one. I mean, that's what I would encourage you to do. You can capture the data, and then you can monitor those areas. You know, you don't have to keep going back to it, but you can definitely check those areas. Yes, sir. You said buy one. Yeah, buy one. What do they cost? The last one I bought was a used one out in Illinois, and it was $15,000. But the first one I bought was about $40,000. And then we had to do a bunch of stuff. We had about $80,000 in it by the time we were done. Yeah, there are a couple different models, but you want the one that measures pH. Then you'll get soil texture. Yeah, the pH is water pH. Okay, and buffer pH in the laboratory today is all calculated. They don't run a buffer extraction any longer because it's toxic. So buffer pH can be a calculation to determine what you need to actually apply for lime. And this, we do everything off of Pell lime, and I don't know if you have Pell lime in this particular geography. But everybody's like, well, that costs too much. How many people have spread ag lime and watched the application of ag lime? Was the wind blowing greater than 5 miles per hour when that happened? Where did all your good lime end up? In the road ditch where you already had a lot of lime, right? Pell lime allows you to apply accurately and spread uniformly. So we're applying Pell lime. The average Pell lime rec on this was 689 pounds. So we'll put on 1,000, 2,000 pounds of Pell lime in certain areas. People are like, why would you do that? Well, neutralizing value of limestone is what we're after. And the reason why I recommend using Pell lime is because you can accurately spread it. And the total cost in this field for what we did on lime across all acres was $6.
So if you use ag lime, how does that equate to the price?
Well, ag lime's a lot cheaper. But if I were to measure the accuracy of spread, it really is poor. Because all of your neutralizing value is the dust, right? That blows away. And then you're getting larger and larger particles within that application, and they're not being spread uniformly either. I don't even compare them. There's no comparison. Just use Pell lime.
We just went away from Pell.
Go back. Somebody sold you on it was cheaper, right? And it did just as good a job. You got to be in the business of effectively placing those products so you can correct that deficiency accurately. The first step is you got to know what your pH actually looks like. So if you have this map, great.
So if you did that on 2.5 acre grid on this, I wonder what your call for tonnage of lime would have been versus what,
A lot more. We have this gridded. I didn't put it up there.
so what was the difference in tonnage?
I think if I were to run on Pell lime off of the 2.5 acre grid, we probably would have had about twice as much Pell lime applied in this field. The denser your data, the more granular your information when you're looking at it, the better decisions you can make.
And you're holding your pH with Pell lime. I mean, that's what we kind of felt like we were struggling to hold our pH.
How much Pell lime were you applying?
About 200 pounds a year.
See, most recommendations are to apply 200 pounds of Pell lime. If I were to look at a liming recommendation, that's just calcium carbonate in a prill, right? Well, I got to have 1,500 pounds or 2,000 pounds or whatever that number is of the effective calcium carbonate equivalency right here. 200 pounds doesn't do it. But if you can accurately place it, then we can go put 1,500 pounds of that product out there, and then your pH will stay where it needs to. But acid soils want to be acid, and alkaline soils want to be alkaline. They always go back to where they want to live. So you're going to always have to have that as part of your process. And why we care about pH is because of nutrient availability. And I get a lot of questions around soil biology and should we be using biological products and what's the benefit of those things. A lot of these nutrients that live in this world are biological in nature: phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, very biological. So if you look at those nutrients, where are they most available? From about a 6. And I would argue that, this is accurate. You can carry that up into about whatever, because it's not biological. But sulfur, a lot of times, if you're focusing solely on the soil providing that and you don't have the biology, you're not going to have enough sulfur, and you're also not going to have enough nitrogen because those microorganisms aren't living in that environment. So if you had the opportunity to spend $20 an acre on a biological product, but your pH was a 4.5, would that be a good investment? No. No, because you got to fix the pH. Or if your pH was a 7.5 or 8, would that be a good investment? No. Because the pH has to come in line to keep all of those critters happy. And in fact, in soybeans, once you get down to about a 5, they will no longer nodulate. And you'll see areas of fields where they yellow up or they're real short. And if you go dig those plants up, there won't be any nodules on them. They're nitrogen deficient. So this is some of our data on soil pH and how it influences soybean yields by texture. This is over about, I think there's about 45,000 acres in this data set. And this has held true pretty much everywhere. And it's a little tough to see, but there's about to the average, there's about a 5 bushel difference. And you can see what really matters is when you get to the tipping point. So once we get below a pH of about 5 in soybeans, things fall out of bed. And when you get to about a 7, well, actually, this is a little over 7 right here. 7, once you're over 7, they start to go the other way too. So if you were to look at this chart, where would you want your pH to be? What's that? A 6. Yeah, so that's what I always lime to. Because I don't want to overspend on lime because I'm a frugal farmer. But I want to get enough ROI, and if I'm buying more lime, but I'm at a point of diminishing return, why would I buy any more? So we want to, once we get to a 5.5, lime it to a 6. And you got to stay in that zone. You can get up to a 6.5, that's fine, but you don't gain any more from that. Unless you're in soils that are calcium deficient. Very sandy soils, places like that, then you're actually fertilizing calcium. It's not the pH that's doing it, it's the lack of calcium. This also has soil texture components. And so pH is a big driver of yield, and soil texture. So these textures here are our optimum textures, and then as we move down, you get into more and more clay. And there's a couple reasons for that. Clay holds water tighter, right? It's harder to extract it, and it can also be more waterlogged. And it also takes a lot more nutrients in these soils to be free to uptake into the plant versus these soils. And if I could supply water to sand, and most sandy soils have an acid base, but if I could fix the pH, apply water, and feed it, I could grow the most bushels of corn and soybeans. Because the nutrients stay available a lot easier, and the water's more available than what we see in this clay. So a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I'll show you a few fields. And this is soil. Well, I'll ask you, what do you think this is a map of? Now my legends are slightly different, but you can see my highest producing areas here and here, and that's this green area. This is a soil texture map. And if I were to look at this, I would say, boy, that's pretty darn close. How many people have taken a grid map, put that on there, and said, boy, that looks like my yield map? How many people are paying for that piece of information? This, to me, tells me that my number one driver of yield, we're measuring texture, but what is it? It's water. Water. That is the nutrient that we have to pursue to get all other nutrients to be available. So soil texture, you can't change it, right? But you can manage it. Yes, this field has quite a bit of clay. This area up here, so I'm showing you two. This is the shallow soil texture. If we go into the deeper soil texture, you'll see more clay, and it doesn't show up as good on the screen. But this area here is much heavier soil. This area here is all of the silt loam type soils. Now here's a thought-provoking question. If I were to go soil sample this, what would my soil test values be? Historically, the lowest yielding place on the farm. It's got heavier textures. And I go take a soil sample out there, what's my soil test value going to say? And I'd wager $100 on this, that all of those soil tests are going to say very high, because I haven't removed those nutrients. Now I'm going to put this back on you to think about your little worksheet there, because I've got a scenario down at the bottom that has sand, but you could substitute clay or anything else. If I were going to think about how I should apply nutrients, how should I apply nutrients in that area? Even though my soil test says it's very high, are nutrients limiting there? Yes, they are. They are not available. Specifically, potassium. That is the first nutrient that I always target because, you know, Iowa State says there's so much potassium in the soil based on this soil test value, and we're going to raise 180, 200 bushel corn. Great. It's a good recommendation. I want to raise 400 bushel corn. And if I'm going to raise 400 bushel corn, that means I've got to make this spot yield 300. And this has to yield 500. Now I'm going to ask you another question. What's the soil test values in this area? In the gutter. Still the best producing because it's got water. But you've extracted all the nutrients from the soil because you've been producing huge crops. And in my experience, most of the time people take the average yield. Let's say this was 220 bushel corn. And we go apply our fertility, even if we're variable rating, we go apply it off of that average and we don't look at what we actually took away. Well, this might have been 300 bushel corn. And that's a significant penalty to what this region can do. And those areas will always get you more bushels. It's a lot easier to get bushels out of this than it is out of this. And here's the pH, and this is really tough to see. And I've drew some lines around the area, but this is also looking at the pH from Veris data, and you can see this area here is high pH. Higher clay, higher pH, which is oftentimes true. You hold more calcium and magnesium, you displace hydrogen. And that's all pH is. Do I have hydrogen? And this chart is nearly impossible to read, but you see a trend, right? So this is texture by pH buckets. The better my texture, the better my yield. The more clay I get, the worse my yield, and it holds true. And when I get into pH values that aren't where they need to be, it can really fall out of bed. You see, as we get into, here we're sitting at a 6.5 pH, 6 to 6.5. That's a pretty good grouping right there. Here's another field. Again, another texture map. Yield map. Looks pretty good to me. What's that? Why is this red? Well, here there's a little bit of soil work that's been done. You can see kind of this terracing. And oh, the yield difference? I don't know what the legend is. This is probably, we're probably talking, you know, 140, 50 bushel corn, and this is 250 bushel corn, probably 100 bushel difference. And then again, the same pH with it outlined, and you can see how those coincide with each other. So from my perspective, you have to understand pH, you have to correct pH, and you also have to understand texture so that you can apply nutrients accordingly. And again, here's that same pH by texture grouping. Anybody have any questions on that stuff?
So how are you putting your nutrients, what you need to manage? Is that from yield data, or are you doing?
Yield data.
Yeah, you don't do grid sample.
I will look at a grid sample one time. Now, most people look at a grid sample and say, well, that's like gold. But it's not. And the laboratories wouldn't want you to know that it's not very accurate. And potassium is basically worthless. Phosphorus is okay. pH is good. But now if you have a better pH tool, what do you need it for? And you're also saying, well, I'm going to try to figure out how to give some credit for what's in the soil. Well, if you're doing that on every 2.5 acres, you've got a lot of gaps in between, based on my experience. I would rather look at this information and say, okay, here's my textures, and this is what I know about soil texture. Clay, not so friendly. Sand, not so friendly. Silt. Good. Now how are you going to fertilize that? You got money in your pocket. You got $150 on average that you were going to spend on fertilizer. Where are you going to put your groceries? I'm going to put them right here. Phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those nutrients need to go right here. Now where are you going to put your nitrogen? Your nitrogen budget needs to go over here. That's where you're lacking nitrogen. That's where you've got higher pH areas. pH is a measurement of hydrogen. If I buy nitrogen, most of the time it has hydrogen with it. Remember the first or the second step that was lower your high pH? You do that by putting hydrogen in the soil. Ammonium sulfate, anhydrous ammonia, ammonium nitrate, plant food. You've got to drive your pH down, and it's tough. But as you buffer against it, your yields will go up.
Does sulfur help to lower that pH?
Yes, sulfur will. If you could go buy a truckload of elemental sulfur, you could accomplish the same thing. In fact, that's one of the best resources. The downside is you're putting a lot of sulfur out there that your plant may not extract. So if I were to make a nitrogen recommendation, you might be putting on 260 pounds of nitrogen in that higher pH soil and 140 pounds in that best yielding soil because it's getting mineralized.
So what do you do to help your texture?
Your texture is your texture, unfortunately. You know, depending on where they set up shop to farm, that's what you got. The only way you can manage your texture is to understand how nutrients react within those textures and adjust accordingly. And then drip irrigation, because I got to fix water. Those are the ways you can start to level out. You're never going to change texture, but you can influence how they react.
What's the best way to check pH without there?
Hand probe. You can buy a little digital hand probe. You can drive around on your four-wheeler and stick it in as many times as you want to. They cost like $300.
What was how often did you run it through the field and like what speed?
Those fields were at 60-foot transects. So every 60 feet we were taking a reading. We've gone down tighter than that. You get more information, which is good. Those were some client fields, and you know, there's a point of diminishing return for what you're paying for. Because realistically, what are you going to be able to spread to? Now, I think in the future, you're going to be able to farm tighter and tighter, right? So having more detailed information, some of the stuff like what Precision Planning's working on with Smart Firmer, those tools, I think there's a lot of promise there.
So that merging machine, you get instant data?
Instantaneous. Now, if I'm doing it, you got to wait for me to go process it. That's always been my problem. Too much stuff going on, too damn slow to get it out the door. But that's why one of my goals and objectives has been to create a software platform that's simple enough for farmers to use it to where you don't have to wait on a guy like me. Everybody suffers the same fate when you're dealing with an agronomist or anyone that has to work in a lot of different facets. Time is your limitation, and you cannot make any more of it. So you can get instant information, and you can run it through systems that can give you recommendations. All right, I better keep moving because I haven't got very far yet. Whew. All right, so step number 3, and I am becoming more and more of an advocate of this as I see greater and greater variability in our seed. Test the seed to determine the cold saturated germ. And something that I may or may not have discussed with you in the past is test the seed for the nutrient load that is contained within the seed. Because we have to set the stage with that first day of planting when we go out. And our goal has got to be to get all those plants out of the ground in a really tight window. And as you push higher and higher yields, the thicker you plant, the more relevant that becomes. And one other thing. Kernel size and orientation dramatically influences. What does that mean? Anybody ever dug up a thousandth of an acre and looked at how the seed fell into the furrow? And looked at how the coleoptile was coming out? Of course not. Who does that? I do that kind of weird stuff. It makes a difference. One of the biggest things that I think we see in dissimilarity of emergence is how that seed is oriented in the furrow. And you're like, well, you can't do anything about that. New technology coming out. We're going to be able to test it next year. It does. Positions the seed tip down in the furrow. Huge, huge results when it comes to uniformity of emergence. And then kernel size and shape. I've oftentimes said if you could pick, you'd go with a small, medium, flat. Fill in the gaps. Every seed guy cringes when I talk. This is some work that was done, Kelly's, where we took and measured ears. I've showed this slide before, but looking at time of emergence and then the yield based on those hours. And you can see within a 6-hour window, we were hitting top yield and then it falls off. And I spend a lot of time talking about ear weight per plant, because I really only care about, can I maximize the yield on one plant and then replicate that? And so we want to get over 0.6 of a pound if we can on every plant. And if you can do that and you can maintain that, then it's just math. Then it's just multiplication. Yes, sir.
So how much difference in time is there from a seed that's pointed down versus one that's pointed up?
You will have about 72 hours difference between one that is tipped down versus one that is the other way.
That's a big deal.
You weren't kidding. In fact, university research shows on average it's about 20% for seed orientation.
That's probably one of our biggest struggles is getting.
It is the #1 issue that exists in soils that are heavier, in colder climates. We cannot get the seeds up uniformly enough to hit the yield that we can actually realistically attain. We have longer day length. We cannot get the uniformity. You have to know what your seed is providing you. You have to know what that cold saturated germ test is. Lots of seed that we ran last year range from 90% to 50%.
What was the rating on the bag?
95. That's what, you're paying for a warm germ. Every person needs to test their seed. I don't care if you do it on your own. Wrap it up in some paper towels and put it in the refrigerator, because that's what you're doing when you're out there planting most of the time. Dramatic differences. And uniformity is what sets the stage. And you can see this is 56,000 plants. And you'll notice there's some beans next to it. We strip crop. This is in some of our research. In fact, I don't even farm that much anymore. I rented most of it out, but I still have to tinker. And you can see that uniformity is pretty good, but there's still variability. And how much does that penalize you? 10 to 30%. So now you start talking about, well, I want to raise, and me, I want to raise 700 bush corn. I don't want to stop at any of the stuff in between. That's already been done. You've got to achieve uniformity to get it. Can't do it any other way. And this is our some of our work here. Step number 4, plant in optimum soil conditions, which everyone's like, yeah, right, you can't do that. And you're right, you can't. You cannot do that in a northern latitude and achieve optimum yield to the average. The longer you can hold out planting corn, the better off you're going to be up until a certain point. And then you start to lose too much day length at the end of the season. And ideally, if we could get everything to come up uniformly, we would be tasseled on June 21st, and you would grain fill with abundance of water and sunlight, and you could do whatever you wanted to. Anybody got a guess at to what that population is? That's 73,000 plants per acre. And we planted it at 77,000. And this is what it looks like. That's what it looked like on August 30th when we took these pictures. Now I'm kind of bunching up a little group there together. But the thicker you plant, the more critical uniformity becomes. Why did I plant at 77,000? 77,000, if I can hit my target ear weights, that gets me to 700 bushel. And I don't have that on the chart, but that's the goal. And we're not going to get there this year. I've got some 56,000 corn that looks really good. We also have that in 15-inch rows, which I think looks better than the 30-inch rows, because we could achieve slightly better uniformity. Stand establishment was worse than the 30-inch row, but there's a lot of opportunity there. Step 5, optimize plant populations and operate your planter like a skilled surgeon. You have to have a planter that is dressed to deliver the end result that you want. And if your planter doesn't have the capabilities to do that, then your realistic, attainable goals need to change. And typically, for most of us, this is where we live on ear weight, about 0.33 pounds of grain per plant. And you can do the math on your own farm. You can say, well, this was my average yield, multiply that by 56 pounds, divide it by the population, and I'll get my ear weight. And you can see what those equate to. And I was in the seed business, I'm still in the seed business, but this was the thing that we always talked about. You know, we got to get these populations up here so we can get maximum yield. But in reality, that wasn't what my whole farm was doing. I had areas that were less productive and areas that were more productive. And then I'd have people ask me, well, how do you build a variable rate seeding recommendation? I don't know, a little thing over here, a little thing over here. That looks good. This looks good. Boom, perfect. I'm an agronomist. I know stuff. I don't like that. I like to use math and equations to tell me what I should be doing. So when I think about things, I think about it the way nature operates. And nature has something called the carrying capacity. Everything in nature has an ecological carrying capacity. Human beings, I think we're encroaching upon that based on the way things are going. Mountain lions, whatever it is, you fill in the blank, there's a carrying capacity. And corn and soybeans are limited, and plants, CO2, water, and the nutrients. And then if you grow them in soil, it's the biology and the chemistry. If I grew them in a hydroponic system, I don't really need to worry about it. I just make sure those things are all in check, and away I go. So here's a carrying capacity chart. Too little or too much makes a big difference. We want to be living in the sweet spot. And that's what we try to do with everything as it relates to what we're doing on our farm, from seeding to fertility and every other component, because if I maximize the carrying capacity, I've maximized the yield and the return on investment. So I'm going to put in a little plug here if you want to check this out. This is, I've been told that I give people too much and I need to give them a little smaller bite-sized pieces. Too much of the pie is hard to eat, so this is a little nugget, and this is really focused on optimizing seeding rates. You can go to this. There's a quick quote tool. You can plug in the best year that you ever had in terms of your average yield, and it will calculate, and your seed costs and your average seeding rate, and it'll calculate your seed savings. Now, why I'm telling you this is because if you go use that quick quote tool, we'll give you 2 fields for free. And you'll see that there's big savings to be had in seed. And when it relates to, and this is another picture at Kelly's here, but you can see ear uniformity, germination, and I believe in this instance, this hybrid down at the bottom was the winner. Strictly because when you look at it, it doesn't have any real misses. Now there's differences in ear weight, but these guys right here, like this, and this guy, and that guy right there, That's a big penalty. Because now that's how you add up to that 10 or 20 or 30% difference. It doesn't take very much. And pretty soon where you thought you were going to be at 300, you're at 220. That's the name of the game right there. And you can see the variability in yield as we look at those plants. We've got plants that are well over 400 bushel corn, a lot of plants in the 300, and then you get those off types and they're penalizing you. Step 6, use a starter fertilizer and increase nutrients lacking in the seed. Now, I've oftentimes scratched my head around starter fertilizer and why does it actually do something? Because that plant doesn't really require anything. At that point in time, it's extracting most of it out of the seed. But I think if we would look at starter fertilizer a little bit differently and look at, in step number 3, measure what's in the seed, send that off to the lab, here's the nutrient composition. Oh, we're really low in zinc. Better make sure we got zinc in the tank. We're really low on zinc, boron, manganese, molybdenum, and phosphorus. Better make sure that's in there. And one of the things that, that we have been trying to figure out how to do for a multitude of years is how to prime the seed. And I've tried to get different people give me some stuff. I finally found a product out of Australia, and I love Australians because they farm in a desert. It's crazy what they can do. And we were getting it shipped up, had to go through China, got caught in COVID, didn't get it till about June. So we're going to run it through germination chamber and see what type of result we get when we actually pre-germinate the seed. And I think that could be a huge step in the right direction for getting uniformity of emergence. This is a picture of some of our dryland corn. When I think about nutrient demands and what I need per plant, this is a little tough to see, but there's an ear, and there's an ear, there's an ear, and there's an ear. 4 ears on 2 stalks. In the middle of a drought. I don't even know what we did, honestly. We have a tremendous amount of double ears. And the only thing that we've really been focused on is potassium, sulfur, nitrogen, boron. And I think boron is the big driver behind what's going on here. Because boron has a major influence in flowering. And I think that's why we're seeing some of these results. Step number 7, set your yield trajectory and maintain it. And use the plants as storage vessels of nutrition. There's going to be a point in time where you are going to spend yourself broke. You can't just keep dumping on nutrients and expect to keep getting an ROI. So there's a sweet spot. And that sweet spot has to coincide with, do I have enough water? Do I have uniform plants? And now can I fulfill the yield trajectory that I've set? So these soybeans are planted at 66,000. There's 390 pods on that plant. That's our average pod count in that. You do the math, I don't know. Depends on what numbers you plug in there. It's not going to be as good as your calculator says. I'll guarantee you that. It never is. But what nutrients are required? How much are those? How to determine what is lacking, and then how do I maintain that uptake? Because the only way a plant takes up nutrients is by having water to pull nutrients in. I brought in some soybeans. This is from a little higher population treatment. This is 170 pods on 122,000. And these are some dryland soybeans at that same 65,000 population. And I think there's a lot of benefit to lower populations in soybeans if you can manage the reason why we plant them thick, weeds. Because that's really the whole reason why we set out, and many moons ago, was we had really terrible herbicides. So you're planting beans at like 230, 40,000. Herbicides got better, seeding rates reduced. Well, when I walk out in a soybean, and again, I'm just an observationist, it's no different than walking a cornfield. And when I see soybeans that got one main stem, little spindly, sick, pukey looking little thing, I'm like, waste of seed. And I want to have these tree trunks, little mini trees out there. because I want to get uniformity of emergence. And don't forget that the thicker you plant a crop, the more critical uniformity becomes. Well, soybeans are no different than corn. You have to treat them exactly the same. Can I get 50 or 60,000 soybeans to come up uniformly, and will I be better off than if I'm planting it at 120, 140, or 160,000? And everybody always says insurance. It's cheap insurance, plant them. There's nothing cheap about it. I can plant that crop 3 times over at 50,000 from the first cost that most people are putting in there. And I really firmly believe that going out and testing those will help you drive more bushels in soybeans. Because what's the one thing we don't do with beans? We don't hardly give them any groceries at all, right? Very little attention is paid to soybeans in terms of fertility, and they're huge users. And we need to really look at them as a crop that could yield in a irrigated environment, could be yielding over 200 bushels. We're not even scratching the surface on those guys. Let's look a little bit about nutrient requirements in corn. And this chart has been shown by a lot of people, and I think there's something that is very confusing, and this is what I want to point out in this chart. So this is basically R1, and we've got about 75% of the nitrogen, 75-80% of the nitrogen has been accumulated. And then it drops off. And the rest of it is increasing. Where is that nitrogen coming from? Somebody said it. The plant. The plant. Now, sulfur's taken up a lot post-tassel coming out of the soil. Zinc's the same way. Magnesium is extracting some out of the soil. Phosphorus, look at how much is moved within the plant. So when I say use your plant as a storage vessel, there are certain nutrients that you need to make sure you've got enough of those nutrients applied to get you to the yield that you seek. And if you're talking about nitrogen and potassium in corn production, it takes a ton of those nutrients. If I'm going to raise 400 bushel corn, I've got to have well over 400 pounds of available nitrogen, and I've got to have well over 400 pounds of available K. Depending on my soil texture, that might translate to I need to have 1,200 pounds of available K to keep enough flowing into the plant. And when you look at your soil test, you're like, I got 140 parts per million. Is that enough? The answer is no. Not for that yield. That's where the realistic goals have to come in line. And again, the micronutrients, and you can see there's a lot of uptake that occurs with some of these micronutrients later on, and there's not a lot of remobilization that's occurring. So that's important to understand what's moving in the plant and what isn't. Well, one of the things that we've been working on is target tissue values, and I still am just, tissue testing. But this is a way to stay on track. So plugging in a yield goal calculates, here's where my tissue values need to be. This is all my mathematical calculation, but it has to have biomass behind it. If you don't have biomass, it doesn't matter. Because there's a difference in this plant versus this plant. And I cannot compare them apples to apples. And again, here's nutrient uptake in soybeans. You can see we've got peak nitrogen. Soybeans are a tremendous user of nitrogen. And basically, once you get to, this is R4. So that plant at R1 beginning bloom, right here, this little tick right there, that's when that plant no longer is extracting nitrogen from its nodules. So where's that nitrogen come from? The soil. And again, back to I'm just driving around the countryside looking at soybeans. Where do the soybeans turn first in most of our fields? The best ground or the worst ground? Huh? The worst ground, typically, right? Low organic matter. There's a reason. Because look what's happening. That plant is reallocating those resources in the plant. They're sucking all of that out of the leaves and the stems, and they're putting it into the grain, and they're turning yellow. That's a clue to me that says, hey, if we're going to raise better yielding beans in those spots, we got to fix nitrogen. And the same thing, look at the use of phosphorus and how that moves. And then K uptake is so steep when it's building that plant architecture. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of nutrition that's required. When do you want to put the nutrition on? You want to put it on over here in November? No, but it might be good to get a big bulk of it on here, another charge here, then finish it out with drip. And again, some of the other secondary nutrients. Look at calcium uptake. Soybeans love calcium. And then the micronutrients. You can see the same type of thing. Most of the micronutrients aren't translocated very well. So if you're going to have a good foliar feeding program, how many foliar applications are you going to have to make? The answer is many. You've got to make multiple applications to keep those values up. Step 8, split apply the nutrients, coincide with uptake, and be ahead of the curve, not behind it. If you're behind, you might as well just say, well, that's as good as it's going to get. And most of the time, we're behind. Step 9, mitigate stress. This is some of our drouthy corn here. Will you have enough water? Maximize evapotranspiration. That leads to maximum yields. You want to have that plant spewing out water to pull nutrients in. If I run out of water, what happens to my evapotranspiration and my nutrient uptake? Done. That's why putting so much in the vessel ahead of time makes a big difference. And especially in a dry land environment, you've got to have it in the tank to finish out the grain. And that's all we're doing. And this corn might all blow down. And you'll see that a lot in areas that are under drought stress because they've extracted everything out of the stalk. And then eliminate disease and insect pressure. And again, here's some more of those double ears that we're seeing. And that's exciting to me because I think next year is going to be a drought. And that's probably going to change what our seeding rate is by a big number in dry land. So I think we're going to shoot for more of those guys. And then step 10, maximize photosynthetic efficiency. And this is the name of the game as a farmer. You are in the business to manage sunlight, CO2, and water. Kurt brings me the water. Sunlight falls from the sky and everybody says, I can't do anything about it. But this system right here lets me influence my photosynthetic efficiency. And these outside rows, they're different populations, but in a lot of instances, it's 56,000. 56,000 ears producing over 1/2 pound of grain or over 500 bushel corn. And then as we move in, we lose that yield advantage from the improved photosynthetic efficiency. And this is a little bit of a joke. I know that looks pretty impressive, but I'm ducked down. Those beans aren't that tall, which is a positive. But anyway, that's the end of my discussion. This is where we're conducting some of this research. We're going to be giving some private tours. So I'm going to invite anybody that wants to come. If you get a group that wants to come up, Tim and Kurt have been there. September 15th and 16th, I know there's probably going to be some harvest encroaching upon us, but we're going to shoot this on the video as well. But there's a lot of interesting things that we're doing there, a lot of different fertility practices. We've got slow release nitrogen trials. We've got phenotype, where you just look at different hybrids and how they react to different changes. You've got some extremely high population corn, very low population corn, and the same in soybeans. And then we also have row spacing. So look us up.
Steve, when you finish
Does not matter, because the seed comes out of the ground. Corn, it matters because all you're doing is the time that that coleoptile takes, wherever that's positioned, because the germ's on the one side of the seed. So if you can point it tip down and orient that germ facing the row, you'll change not only how fast it comes out of the ground, but the way the leaves are oriented. And this is a perfect picture. I got to go back here a ways. But this is a perfect example of how the corn plant is out of position. Go. Right here. See these ears? Now this is an extremely high population, but you see how these ears are, if that plant orients its leaves correctly, meaning they're not within the row kind of wishy-washy, all of these will show up on the same side. And that will change the yield champions from the south to the north, if we can do that. There's a company that's got, they're just sending out, there's a few rows of it. Of course, I was real nerdy and geeking out on it. It'll probably suck the first year out. It might not even work at all, but we're going to find out. I mean, but the name of the product is called AeroTube. And they're aerospace engineers, so I hope they know what they're talking about. But anyway, it basically creates a centrifuge that orients the seed. It's pretty cool. Yes, sir.
Another question. All right. On the cold journey we're talking about, you mentioned that we need to do the test.
Mm-hmm.
You know what a cold journey is. What do you do with that information? You change seed? You do something to manage that cold journey flow?
Yeah, I won't plant it if it's poor.
You just get it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, my opinion of genetics and what we see reflected in the yields that we get is a response to how well the hybrids handle stress. Okay, so when we harvest the final yield, all we're showcasing is the stress response. We're not showcasing yield potential. Does that make sense? All we've done is said, okay, this hybrid's got a little bit better tolerance to lack of water. This hybrid's got a little better tolerance to this disease pressure. We're not close to achieving the genetic potential. So if you go out of the gate with something that doesn't have a good germination score, you've automatically added that stress on day number one. And there's going to be enough problems through the growing season.
One other question. Do you strip your fertilizer to the broadcast?
Typically, we would band it. In our plot, we've got a lot of very high potassium treatments, and that was broadcast. All of our nitrogen is banded or side dressed. We've used plant food, which Kelly might touch on at the grower panel, which is high phosphorus. That would have been broadcast, applied. Let's just say we're not short on phosphorus. Put quite a bit on. So that's not really a huge limitation. Now, I will say that we do some banding of a little bit of phosphorus with our other product, nitrogen, et cetera. There's some synergy that exists there. So we try to boost the payload a little bit, but not in a total program. In a real long-winded answer that I just gave you, band as much as you can. That's the correct answer. Unless you've got access to a whole bunch of other stuff. Yes, sir.
So the nutrient composition of your seed has nothing to do with the size of the seed?
The question was, does nutrient composition have anything to do with the size of the seed? And the answer to that is no, it has to do with the growing conditions. What that plant went through is no different in seed production than it is in your commercial fields. And so if there's been a hidden hunger that exists, and a lot of times it's micronutrients, Sometimes it's phosphorus. Phosphorus is real big in grain fill. That's where you get the energy for that plant to really get out of the ground. That will be contingent solely on the growing conditions that seed was produced under. The only way to know is to check it.
Back to that case, I'm kind of old now, but I remember older farmers, before hybrid seed, they used to try to get the largest kernel.
Mm-hmm.
Was that follow that they felt that the composition was better?
But
Those larger kernels?
potentially, I think that in that open pollinated situation, they were really looking for, is that plant phenotypically expressing the right genetics? In reality, it may have been something that was going on in the ground. It could have been the roots. It could have been any number of things. I don't know. I'm too young to answer that appropriately. Yes, sir. Yep. That's a density, right? Because you could have a real starchy seed that isn't very dense and is just kind of fluffy. And you could have more starch in a smaller kernel that was very dense. That's where test weight comes into it. When you're talking about overall ear weight and how are you getting ear weight, kernel size is going to be a big driver of that, and how dense is that kernel, and then what are the other ingredients. If I were going to go out and make a recommendation of how to increase your ear weight at the end of the season, if you had enough water, you got to give it iron, manganese, zinc, copper, those ingredients. Why? Periodic table says that those are molecularly very heavy. And the more of them I can get to shove into the seed, the heavier my seed gets. And you will see when you look at seed that you sample, those nutrients are not going to be there. Probably, we don't even know what the quantities need to be, but they're not going to be there in the amounts that we need them to create this uniform environment that we're pursuing. Any other questions? Got real windy there. I apologize. I appreciate everybody's time, and I hope you have a safe and successful harvest if we don't see you in September.
Thank you, Steve.